5:47 a.m. Norfolk, Virginia. Elizabeth River waterfront. Gray light hadn't reached the water yet when 12 HRT agents formed up at the loading door of a sailmaker's loft that most people in this port had passed 100 times without noticing. Behind them, the river was black. Above it, a CBP Blackhawk held steady 200 feet off the water, its thermal camera locked on the second floor. The rotor wash was the only sound on the water at that hour. The breach team leader pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece, listened, gave a single nod. The door came off its hinges at 5:49 a.m. What the HRT stack found on that second floor, 14 heat signatures that thermal imaging had tracked for 9 straight days, had been hidden in plain sight for 98 days. Hidden behind a business that stitched storm covers for tugboats. Hidden behind a name every Atlantic Fleet skipper recognized. Hidden behind paperwork belonging to Eleanor Marsh, widow of Navy Lieutenant Commander Harold Marsh, who went down with a P-3 Orion in the North Atlantic in 1998. The cover was nearly perfect. What cracked it was a single line on a shipping manifest. A line noticed by a woman who wasn't looking to crack anything. She had simply been looking for a friend. Her name was Reyes. Daniela Reyes. She had served 6 years as a search and rescue corpsman with the Navy before leaving in 2022. In the Navy, she had worked out of Naval Air Station Jacksonville and later out of a forward deployed unit in the Western Pacific. The work was exactly what it sounds like, finding people lost in water, under conditions where recovery time narrowed with every passing hour. She had pulled 17 people from open water. She had also been part of teams that recovered those who couldn't be pulled out in time. The job left marks. The methodology it built, systematic, unemotional, sequenced by priority, didn't leave when the uniform did. In October of 2025, her childhood friend, Marisol Vega, 24 years old, stopped returning texts, stopped answering her door, stopped appearing at the diner where she worked Tuesday through Saturday breakfast shifts. Marisol's employer reported her missing to Norfolk police on October 22, 2025. A detective was assigned. Inquiries were made. No leads developed in the first 2 weeks. Daniela Reyes wasn't willing to wait. She had spent 6 years learning to find people in open water with limited information and a narrowing window. That instinct didn't leave when the uniform did. She started where anyone who knew the waterfront would start. She walked it. She talked to dock workers, to the regulars at the waterfront coffee counter, to the harbor master's assistant. She asked whether anyone had seen Marisol near the water before she vanished. She did this methodically, working outward from Marisol's apartment in expanding 3-block radius. She kept a notebook. She wrote down names, times, specific details of what each person reported, and she cross-referenced them the way she had been trained to cross-reference position reports, looking for the overlap, the confirmed datum, the piece of information that appeared independently from 2 different sources. It took 4 days of walking before she found it. One dock worker mentioned that Marisol had been seen talking to a man outside the old Callaway & Sons sailmaking building on a Thursday evening in mid-October. Just talking. Nothing alarming. But that was 3 days before she disappeared. 2 days after that conversation, Reyes found a second source, a woman who ran a mobile food cart 2 blocks from the waterfront, who had independently noticed Marisol near the same building on the same evening, standing by the riverside loading bay door. The woman remembered it because Marisol had been a regular customer and the cart operator had considered calling out to her, but the conversation seemed serious and she didn't want to interrupt. 2 independent accounts. Same location. Same evening. 3 days before Marisol vanished. Callaway & Sons Sailmaking. 91 years in business on this waterfront. The building had been there since the 1930s. A long, low brick structure with a weathered sign, a riverside loading bay, and a sealed second floor that the current business never used for public purposes. The owner was Eleanor Marsh, 71 years old, widow of Navy Lieutenant Commander Harold Marsh, who died when his P-3 Orion went down in the North Atlantic on March 17, 1998. She had inherited the business from her father-in-law. She kept it running quietly. The company held a VA preferred vendor designation. Its accounts were clean. It didn't draw attention. Daniela Reyes wasn't a federal investigator. She was a former corpsman with a missing friend and a methodical mind. She started pulling whatever public information she could find on the building. Business filings. Permit records. Then, through a contact from her Navy days, a logistics clerk at the Naval Station Supply Office, she obtained a copy of the company's shipping manifest summary. Not classified. Not restricted. A routine logistics document that vendors submitted as part of the VA audit process. The clerk pulled it from the vendor portal without particular concern, the kind of document that moved through logistics offices 100 times a week. She read it twice. Then she read it again. Callaway & Sons received weekly deliveries from a textile supplier in Charlotte, North Carolina. Canvas rolls. Thread stock. Industrial fastener sets. All consistent with a working sailmaker's operation. But buried in 6 consecutive weekly entries, repeating without variation, children's clothing. Sizes 2 through 14. Socks. Undergarments. Sweatshirts. Delivered weekly in bulk to a building with no retail operation, no public-facing storefront, no children's program, no charitable distribution record. Reyes sat with the manifest for a long time after reading it the second time. She told investigators later that she didn't immediately reach for the phone because she wanted to be certain she was reading what she thought she was reading and not constructing a pattern from coincidence. She went through the 6 entries one by one. She calculated quantities from the unit counts listed. She looked up the Charlotte supplier online and confirmed it had no public charitable mission and no connection to any children's organization. She spent approximately 40 minutes on this process before she was satisfied that there was no innocent interpretation she had missed. There was no version of that detail that made sense. Daniela Reyes printed the manifest on a Friday morning in November of 2025 and walked into the NC's field office at Naval Station Norfolk 40 minutes later. The duty agent was Special Agent Marcus Webb, a 12-year NCS veteran who had worked procurement fraud cases and spent 3 years on a joint task force targeting defense contractor financial fraud in the Hampton Roads area. He knew the vendor documentation landscape the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not because he found it interesting, but because he had spent years learning what wrong looked like when it was trying to look right. He listened to Reyes describe the manifest discrepancy without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. How certain was she about the document's authenticity? And did she have the contact information for the logistics clerk who provided it? She answered yes to both. She handed him the printed manifest, her notebook, and a 1-page summary she had written that morning, in clear procedural language, of every step she had taken from the day Marisol stopped answering texts to the moment she walked through the NCS door. Webb didn't set the manifest aside. He walked it to his supervisor within the hour. By Monday morning, a joint task force had been authorized. NCIS Norfolk as lead agency. FBI's hostage rescue team on standby. Homeland Security investigations attached for the financial thread. A 9-day surveillance package was approved the same afternoon. Here is what surprised about how this operation unfolded. The surveillance team almost didn't get the warrant. The first draft went to a federal magistrate on Monday afternoon, and he pushed back. The manifest anomaly alone was suggestive but not sufficient for a full thermal and utility surveillance package on a VA-designated vendor. The affidavit needed more. His concern was reasonable. A legitimate business could have explanations for unusual manifest entries, a charitable side arrangement, a vendor error, a mislabeled shipment category that was never corrected. Those explanations weren't likely given the full picture Reyes had assembled, but likely wasn't the legal standard. The magistrate needed probable cause, and what the first affidavit offered was a suggestive anomaly sitting on top of a missing persons case that hadn't been officially connected to the building. Webb's team had 48 hours to find it. They went to the utility records first. A subpoena for Dominion Energy billing on the Callaway address for the preceding 6 months came back within 24 hours. What it showed stopped the room. A sailmaker's operation, industrial sewing machines, lighting, a single freight elevator, climate control for canvas storage, should draw somewhere between 800 and 1,200 kilowatt hours per month. Webb's team had pulled comparison data from 3 other maritime canvas operations in the Hampton Roads area to establish that baseline. 800 to 1,200. That was the number. The Callaway building had drawn an average of 6,900 kilowatt hours per month for the preceding 5 months. 6 times the operational ceiling for the declared business activity. Power at that level didn't run sewing machines. It ran climate-controlled residential systems, ventilation, refrigeration, cooking appliances, hot water heaters running on heavy daily demand. The energy signature looked less like a manufacturing operation and more like a mid-sized residential facility operating around the clock. The revised affidavit went back to the magistrate on Wednesday morning. The warrant was signed Wednesday afternoon. Surveillance began on Thursday, day 1 of 9. The thermal imaging was mounted on a leased commercial vessel that ran routine charter trips on the Elizabeth River, a cover that required no shore personnel and drew no attention. The vessel's public charter schedule gave it a legitimate reason to pass the waterfront at regular intervals, and the thermal camera had been integrated into equipment that was indistinguishable from standard hydrographic survey equipment. The camera focused on the 2nd floor of the Callaway building for 12-hour blocks, day and night. 2 analysts monitored the feeds in 6-hour shifts from a secure room at the NCIS field office. The heat signatures were present every reading. 14 distinct signatures. Consistent spacing. No adult height profiles among them. The signatures moved in predictable patterns, clustered near what appeared to be a bathroom, dispersed across what seemed to be a large open floor, concentrated near one wall overnight. The patterns were consistent across all 9 days. They didn't vary. The overnight clustering was particularly telling. Adult populations in confined spaces tend to spread out when they sleep, seeking whatever privacy the space allows. This clustering was consistent with individuals who had established fixed sleeping positions over an extended period, the kind of arrangement that forms when a group has been in the same location long enough to develop routine. On day 3, an NCIS analyst pulled the building's original floor plans from the city permits archive. The 2nd floor was a single open loft, 12,000 square feet, with 2 bathrooms and 1 service staircase. The sealed loading bay door had been used to move large canvas rolls from delivery barges. It hadn't been opened for legitimate business purposes in over 20 years. That door is where HRT would eventually enter. I spent time going through the full surveillance log, and one detail kept returning: the regularity of the heat signatures. 14 positions. Same spacing. Same overnight clustering. For 9 days without a single variation. That kind of regularity doesn't happen by accident. It indicated a controlled environment, a managed population. The signatures never went below 14. On 2 occasions during the 9-day window, analysts noted brief periods, each lasting less than 40 minutes, when the signatures redistributed, moving away from their standard pattern and concentrating near the bathroom in a sequential pattern that suggested supervised access. That word appeared in the analyst's notes both times. The detail was flagged and included in the task force briefing on day 4. On day 4, the task force received results from a records check on the weekly textile delivery vehicle, a white box truck registered to the Charlotte supplier. Traffic camera footage from 2 intersections confirmed the vehicle's route on 3 consecutive delivery days. On each delivery, the truck entered through the ground floor bay, remained for between 22 and 31 minutes, and exited. The delivery pattern was efficient. It didn't involve the back and forth that legitimate commercial deliveries typically generate. No paperwork discussions in the doorway, no count disputes, no driver waiting while someone checked an invoice. The truck arrived, went in, came out, left. On day 5, the task force expanded its financial investigation. HSI analysts began tracing the corporate ownership of Callaway & Sons backward through its filing history. What they found was a layered shell structure constructed carefully over years. Eleanor Marsh was the owner of record, and she was real, a 71-year-old widow living in Chesapeake, Virginia, who appeared to have no involvement in day-to-day operations. Investigators made a quiet inquiry through local law enforcement to confirm her status. She was home. She was cooperative when approached in a way that didn't reveal the scope of the investigation. She told the detective at her front door that she had signed papers years ago at the suggestion of her late husband's business attorney, papers relating to management of the sailmaking building, because she didn't want to deal with it after Harold died and her father-in-law passed. She didn't know the name Tidewater Maritime Consulting. She didn't know the name Raymond Voss. She had been a clean signature on a dirty document. The actual management had been quietly transferred through property management agreements and LLC assignments to a company called Tidewater Maritime Consulting, LLC, incorporated in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2021. The transfer had been accomplished through instruments that were facially legal, property management agreements of a type that attorneys file routinely on behalf of elderly property owners who want passive income without administrative burden. Nothing in the documents, read in isolation, would draw scrutiny. That was the design. The registered agent for Tidewater Maritime Consulting was a man named Raymond Voss. Raymond Voss had no criminal record in U.S. federal databases. He held a current Coast Guard merchant mariner credential. His work history showed stints as a cargo officer on bulk carriers operating between Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Atlantic coast ports, Baltimore, Norfolk, Wilmington. He was 63 years old. He had property in the Dominican Republic and a registered address in St. Croix. His credentials were legitimate. His reputation in the cargo community, based on informal inquiries during day 5 and 6, was unremarkable. Competent, quiet, reliable, someone who handled documentation efficiently and didn't create problems at customs. That description carried different weight after HSI analysts finished cross-referencing his vessel history. The connection between Voss and a Caribbean feeder network became clear on day 6, when HSI analysts cross-referenced his vessel contacts against a Homeland Security database flagging suspect cargo movements through the Puerto Rico Customs District. 3 vessels that Voss had served on as cargo officer between 2022 and 2024 had been previously flagged for irregular manifest discrepancies, the same type of discrepancy Reyes had noticed on the Callaway manifest. Sizes. Children's clothing. Delivered to addresses with no retail arm. The earlier flags had been reviewed and set aside as low-priority anomalies in the Puerto Rico district's backlog. No one had connected them to each other or to anything onshore because no one had yet found the onshore node. Now they had the node, and they had the history that connected it to the corridor. The network had been using the Atlantic cargo corridor for at least 3 years. The Callaway building was its current inland node. What makes this case operationally significant is the specific mechanism of the cover. The building's VA preferred vendor designation functioned as a bureaucratic immunity shield. VA preferred vendors face reduced audit frequency compared to standard federal contractors. The designation was earned legitimately by the Marsh family decades ago. It was never reviewed after ownership effectively transferred. The shell exploited institutional trust built over 90 years and then simply left standing. The audit calendar that should have caught the energy anomaly, the manifest irregularities, the management transfer, that calendar had a gap built into it by policy, and the network had located that gap and built its operation inside it. The cover wasn't the widow. The cover was the reputation she had inherited and no longer controlled. On day 7, the task force identified 4 individuals who had been observed entering and exiting the building. They were adult males, ranging in age from 30 to approximately 50. None were Raymond Voss. 2 were later identified through facial recognition as individuals with prior immigration enforcement encounters, 1 in Dominican Republic exit records, 1 flagged in Puerto Rico customs processing from 2023. The other 2 were identified only after arrest. The 4 men operated in overlapping shifts that the surveillance team had mapped. At least 1 was present in the building at all times. Shift changes happened in early morning and early evening, consistent with patterns the thermal analysts had noted, when the second-floor signatures showed their brief redistributions. The shift rotations were the supervised access windows. Once understood, the analysts' earlier notes read very differently. On day 7, the task force also conducted a quiet canvass of the residential buildings adjacent to the Callaway structure. A tenant in an apartment building across the alley described an observation she had made in the preceding weeks. She had noticed, on several occasions in late evening, a faint sound from the direction of the sailmaker's building that she had assumed was wind through the old structure's ventilation. She hadn't thought much of it. She couldn't be more specific. The investigator who took her statement forwarded it without editorial comment. It wasn't used in any affidavit. It stayed in the investigative file. That kind of detail stays with you. Here is the take that will probably draw disagreement. The decision to run a full 9-day surveillance window before breaching was correct, even knowing what was on that second floor. The impulse to move faster is understandable. The thermal signatures were visible since day 1. The energy data was already in hand. A prosecutor could argue that probable cause for emergency entry was met by the end of day 2, and that every day thereafter was a day the situation was allowed to continue while the task force built toward a cleaner evidentiary package. But that argument misunderstands what the 9 days accomplished. A premature breach, one that scattered the handlers, lost the evidence chain, or gave Voss any warning, would have collapsed the prosecution. The manifest discrepancies would have remained the central piece of physical evidence, and defense attorneys would have spent years attacking the chain of custody on a document obtained informally through a logistics clerk contact. The financial shell connecting Tidewater Maritime Consulting to the network's offshore accounts would not have been identified. Voss would have been in the Dominican Republic before any federal warrant reached his St. Croix address. The facilitators named in the indictment as unindicted co-conspirators would never have been identified. The 9 days built the case that will keep these operators away from any operation for a very long time. Patience, in this instance, was correct. Even with the clock running. On day 8, the task force received confirmation that Raymond Voss had purchased a one-way airline ticket from Norfolk International Airport to Santo Domingo, departing 9 days from the point of warrant execution, meaning he was scheduled to leave within 48 hours of the planned breach. The ticket had been purchased under a secondary identity that HSI analysts identified through passport cross-reference against Caribbean customs records. Voss had used that secondary identity for at least 2 prior international transits. It was a legally obtained secondary nationality document issued through a citizenship by investment program in a Caribbean jurisdiction that he had apparently maintained as an exit option. The operation had already been scheduled. The Voss departure timeline confirmed it had been scheduled correctly. The task force had been working toward a breach window at the end of the 9-day period, and the ticket information arrived on the morning of day 8 as confirmation rather than catalyst. On the evening before the operation, Webb and the HRT team leader walked the revised building plans one final time. The original floor plans showed the staircase location, but thermal imaging on day 8 had flagged a thermal anomaly on the ground floor, a heat signature consistent with a second interior staircase, not shown in the plans, apparently constructed after the last permitted renovation. The anomaly had first appeared as a faint differential in the ground floor readings, warmer than the surrounding brick foundation, by a margin the analyst had initially logged as possible pipe insulation. On day 8, she reviewed prior 7 days of ground floor readings and found the same differential in every scan. She flagged it, possible interior structural element not reflected in archived plans. The floor plans were 20 years out of date. That was the obstacle. 20 minutes before the full tactical briefing on the eve of the breach, the team leader stopped the presentation and reassigned the ground floor clearance team to 2 entry points instead of 1. If the building had interior geography that didn't match the filed plans, a single-point ground entry created a pinch point, a position where agents moving through unexpected interior wall configuration could be caught between structure and an exit they hadn't confirmed was clear. 2 simultaneous entry points, the street-side office entrance for NCS agents and the riverside loading bay for HRT, eliminated it. Each team would see the other's entry corridor from a different axis. Any interior geography that surprised one team would be visible to the other. The revision took 11 minutes to fully brief and redistribute across team assignments. The team leader ran it twice to make sure every agent had the updated entry assignment memorized. Written plans were collected at the end of the briefing. Nothing went home. The operational briefing materials were secured in the NCIS field office safe. The Black Hawk crew was already tasked with waterside overwatch. CBP Air and Marine Operations had been briefed and had positioned a 2nd Marine unit 3 nautical miles down the river as a waterborne intercept element, in case any occupant attempted to exit through the riverside bay and enter the water. The intercept unit had run 2 dry positioning exercises on the river earlier in the week under the cover of routine patrol operations. A Navy medical team was staged at Naval Station Norfolk, 3 minutes by vehicle from the loft. The medical team had been briefed on the likely age range and had pre-staged pediatric assessment supplies alongside standard emergency medical load. No one slept much that night. 5:47 a.m. The stack formed up. The breach coordinator's radio crackled once. Confirmation that the CBP Black Hawk was on station. Thermal showing 14 signatures. All present, all stationary, consistent with sleep. The pier was cold. The river surface held a faint mist that had settled in the hour before dawn, and the brick wall of the Callaway building was slick with it. The point man in the HRT stack adjusted his grip on the door ram and looked back at the team leader. The team leader looked at his watch, looked at the door, gave the count on his fingers. 5:49 a.m. The riverside loading bay door came off. The mechanism that held it was a commercial-grade slide bolt on the interior, reinforced with a steel bar bracket that the network had installed. The HRT ram took it on the first strike. The door swung inward and the stack moved. The HRT stack moved up the interior staircase in a tight column, the point man's weapon light cutting the dark ahead. The staircase was steeper than the floor plan indicated. The rebuilt interior staircase that the thermal analyst had flagged on day 8 had replaced the original with a narrower, more vertical run that forced the column to move in single file with less lateral clearance than the entry briefing had assumed. The team leader, positioned 4th in the column, noted it and said nothing. The stack moved at pace. Speed and surprise were the margin. The 2nd floor loft was large, 12,000 square feet of open industrial space. In the sweep of the lights came visible a series of partitioned areas created with hung canvas dividers, the kind of heavy canvas a sailmaker's operation would have in abundance. The dividers had been suspended from the loft's overhead beam structure using industrial rigging hardware. They created enclosed spaces within the open floor that were habitable but controllable. Cots. Blankets folded in the standard manner of institutional bedding. A folding table near the south wall with food containers, bulk rice, canned goods, a commercial-grade hot plate. A single string of work lights running from a power strip. The infrastructure of concealment, assembled from components any hardware store would sell, inside a building that Norfolk hadn't inspected in 7 years because its VA designation had moved it to reduced frequency audit schedule. The team leader keyed his radio. All 14 accounted for. All responsive. No threats on the floor. The NCIS agents who entered through the ground floor office encountered the 4 handlers. 3 were in the office space. 1 had been sleeping in a back room that the original floor plans showed as a storage closet, but which had been converted into a sleeping area during the building's current operation. The sleeping area contained a cot, a prepaid cell phone that was later recovered by the digital forensics unit, and a set of car keys. All 4 were taken into custody before anyone reached the street side exit. No shots fired. No resistance beyond verbal. The arithmetic was visible before anyone explained it. The K-9 unit deployed to the 2nd floor completed a sweep in 11 minutes, clearing the partitioned areas and confirming no additional concealed personnel. The dog moved through each canvas-divided compartment methodically, and its handler marked each compartment clear with a grease pencil, a low-tech confirmation system that required no radio traffic and left a visible record for the agents behind the sweep team. By 6:14 a.m., 25 minutes after the breach, all 14 individuals on the 2nd floor had been escorted down the riverside staircase and out onto the pier, where they were met by the Navy medical team with blankets, water, and a Spanish-language interpreter. The medical team's initial assessment was conducted on the pier with portable examination equipment, and 2 individuals were transported by vehicle to the Naval Station Medical Facility. The remaining 12 were assessed on site and then moved by van to a secure facility where Federal Victim Services personnel and additional interpreters were waiting. The pier assessment took 41 minutes. During that time, the mist on the river had begun to lift. The first real gray light of the morning was reaching the water by the time the last van pulled away, and the Black Hawk had shifted to a wider patrol orbit over the waterfront district. 9 of the 14 were U.S. citizens, reported missing from 4 states: Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, over a period spanning the preceding 18 months. The longest missing had been reported gone from Jacksonville, Florida, 341 days before they walked out onto that pier. Their parents hadn't stopped searching. A detective in Jacksonville had kept the file open on his own desk, off the active rotation, but never closed, for 11 months. He had continued running database checks on his own time, continued making quarterly calls to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, continued maintaining contact with the family even as the institutional momentum had faded. He had a photograph on his desk. He hadn't moved the photograph to the closed files cabinet because he wasn't convinced the case was closed, even when the system's attention had moved elsewhere. 5 of the 14 had been moved through Puerto Rico as part of the Caribbean feeder corridor that HSI had traced through Voss's vessel history. Their entry into the network's logistics chain had occurred upstream of the Callaway loft, and the precise documentation of how they had moved from their origin points into the feeder system was an active thread of the prosecution's ongoing investigation when the indictments were unsealed. Put yourself in the position of the Jacksonville detective for a moment. 11 months of keeping a file alive that the system had quietly deprioritized, and then getting the phone call at 6:22 a.m. on a November morning in 2025, telling you that the case had just resolved on a waterfront in Virginia. There is a line in the post-operation report that notes the detective requested authorization to travel to Norfolk at his own expense, to be present for the family reunification. The department later reimbursed him. That detail does not appear in the indictment. It appears in a single footnote of the HSI field report. That detail stayed with me. In the days following the operation, the victim services teams working with the 14 individuals began the process of notification, contacting families and law enforcement agencies that had filed the original missing persons reports. This process, in cases involving individuals missing for extended periods, is not a simple phone call. Families prepare for bad news. They have spent months preparing for bad news, and the call that comes to tell them the outcome is not the worst one, requires a specific kind of conversation that victim services staff at the Eastern District are trained to conduct. Some of those conversations lasted more than an hour. The individuals recovered from the loft had experienced prolonged confinement in a controlled environment, and the reunification process was understood from the beginning to be a long-term undertaking. Raymond Voss was arrested at his registered St. Croix address by HSI agents operating in coordination with U.S. Virgin Islands authorities at 6:51 a.m. Eastern, 2 minutes after the pier clearance was confirmed in Norfolk. The timing was deliberate. The task force had identified a secondary communication protocol that Voss used, a satellite messaging application on a device registered to a shell entity in the Cayman Islands. If Voss had received a warning before his own arrest, investigators believed he had a contingency exit route that would have moved him through the Dominican Republic and out of U.S. extradition reach within hours. The assessment was based on the one-way ticket under the secondary identity and on a pattern in his satellite messaging history, reviewed under a separate warrant, that showed he had used that channel to coordinate at least 2 prior instances of rapid repositioning. The simultaneous arrest removed that possibility. Voss was in his St. Croix residence when the HSI team arrived. He didn't resist. He asked, once, whether he could make a phone call before being transported. The answer was no. The sealed indictments, filed with the Eastern District of Virginia Federal Court the same morning, named Raymond Voss on federal charges including conspiracy, transportation, and document fraud. The 4 handlers arrested at the loft faced the same federal conspiracy charges plus an additional count related to the forged customs paperwork recovered from the ground floor office, a collection of documentation that had been used to legitimize the textile deliveries, including the children's clothing manifests that first caught Reyes's eye. The forged paperwork was substantial. Over 300 individual documents, organized in binder sets in the office's filing cabinet, each one representing a delivery processed through the VA supply chain audit system without triggering review. The filing system was meticulous. The handlers had maintained records the way a legitimate business maintains records, cross-referenced, dated, filed by vendor number. It was a bureaucratic operation wearing commercial clothing. 2 additional names appeared in the sealed indictments as unindicted co-conspirators, individuals described as shipyard-adjacent facilitators who had provided logistical access and routing information to the network. Those 2 individuals hadn't been arrested as of the date the indictments were unsealed. Their status: fugitives. Active federal warrants outstanding. The evidence table that HSI assembled in the hours following the raid included the forged customs paperwork, over 300 individual documents, along with financial records, the satellite messaging device, and the textile delivery manifests spanning the entire operational period. The digital forensics team worked through the night on the prepaid cell phone recovered from the handler's sleeping area and on 2 additional devices found in the ground floor office. The satellite messaging device belonging to Voss was secured and transported separately for processing by a specialized unit. Forensic accountants began tracing the financial flows back through Tidewater Maritime Consulting to the Caribbean feeder network. The accounting work was expected to take months. The financial architecture had been built with the same attention to layering that characterized every element of the operation. What they found extended well beyond the Norfolk operation. The feeder network, as reconstructed from Voss's communications and financial records, had used at least 3 prior inland nodes, one in Wilmington, North Carolina, one in the Baltimore area, and one in an unspecified Gulf Coast location, identified only in the network's internal documentation. The Callaway loft had been the 4th. The prior 3 had been vacated before federal attention reached them. Each vacated node had left behind only trace evidence, cleaning product residue consistent with deliberate sanitization, generic bedding components that couldn't be sourced to any supplier, and, in the Baltimore location, a single child's sock found behind a baseboard in what structural analysis suggested had been the bathroom access corridor. The sock was logged, photographed, and submitted to the FBI's evidence repository. It couldn't be connected to any specific missing persons case in the national database. Whether the network had been alerted to investigative interest in those earlier locations or simply rotated nodes as a standard operational protocol wasn't determined by the time the indictments were unsealed. Investigators had found, in Voss's satellite messaging history, a reference to what appeared to be a rotation schedule, a recurring interval, described in terms requiring context to interpret, which HSI analysts believed represented a planned relocation.